Hello, my name is Dr. Sarah Young, and I am going to be leading here a short recorded lecture on Federalist Paper 39. I am an associate professor here in the political science program and here at the University of South Carolina, Aiken. Again, Federalist Papers 39 is one of those founding documents that has been assigned to you as a part of REACH Act compliance for this class. There are two major questions that Federalist 39 attempts to answer. The first one is, what is a republic? We know that the founders were very committed to the idea of instituting a republican form of government. But in this document, they really drill down into what they mean by that in a more specific way than they had in previous documents. The other thing that they talk about in this Federalist 39 document extensively is how should we think of this republic? Does this republic shore up power and authority at the national level, or does it shore up power and authority more at the state level? And so they go into a discussion of ways the Constitution is actually, in fact, doing both. It's shoring up power at both levels and creating a blended system. First, let's take up that first issue of what is a republic. Recall from Federalist 10, which was another one of those REACH Act documents that you've been assigned, that the author in that document, which is probably James Madison, promoted heavily the use of a republic as a way of organizing power in this new United States. And specifically, he wanted that use of a republic to be at the national level. You know, it wasn't good enough to have republican sort of structures just at the state level. You had to have that republican form of government instituted at a nationwide level. Now, what do they mean by republic? Recall we've used, sort of broadly the notion that a republic is a government that features some sort of representative assemblies where representatives, right, are elected or maybe in some cases appointed or selected that will then represent the people more broadly. We also think of republics generally as sort of maybe a form of government, self-government, sometimes where somehow the people are involved in the government and they have some say-so in who gets elected to that government. But these are sort of vague ways of thinking of a republic. The founders say we really need to define what we mean by a republic, what makes a republic, because they say, different countries and different places have different interpretations of it. Excuse me. He says that different places have different interpretations, and they're using this term republic very broadly and loosely. He takes issue with three nation states in particular. He talks about England, he talks about Poland, and he talks about Venice. He says all of these places are calling themselves, governments that use some sort of republican structure, but they're not really, because they're aristocracies, and most of them, the ruling is done by the monarchy, and they might have, like, say, in the case of England, the House of Commons, which is sort of a representative body. But when you really look at where power is flowing from, it's ultimately coming from the monarchy. The monarchy is really making most of the decisions. The monarchy is appointing the nobles to the House of Lords. And really, when it gets down to it, the House of Commons just doesn't really have that much representative power at that point. So the point he's trying to make is that just calling yourself a republic and saying you're doing it to represent the people isn't good enough. That the power itself has to flow from the people for it to be a republic. Publius says that it is a government where power is derived from the people either directly or indirectly. It's not enough to have an assembly or body saying we're doing this in the interest of representing the people. The power itself to select that assembly or to select the other branches of government, for that matter, has to come from the people. Now, either indirectly or directly. So it could be a situation where voters are directly voting people into office, or it could be through more indirect means that, the voters vote for a body of people, and then that body, that representative body, then goes on and votes for other or selects officers for other offices, that would also qualify as a republic. So there's got to be some connection between the voters selecting the leaders and the ultimate people that lead. And I wanted to show you a flow chart to kind of get into what they mean by this. Now, obviously, this flow chart is not in the actual Federalist 39 document, but I'm using it as sort of a learning tool to kind of unpack some of this core argument they're making about power flowing either directly or indirectly from the voters and the citizens. So when you think about, for instance, the legislature of the national government, it's the House of Representatives and the Senate. We know that the House of Representatives, how do they get their job? How do the representatives get elected? They get elected directly by the people. So there you see a direct link between the voters and the selection of the representatives. Now with the Senate, it was a little different. At the time, the state legislatures were appointing the senators. Now we elect our senators by a vote of the people, but back then they were appointing it through the state legislatures. That was the way the original Constitution had structured it. You might say, well, that's not very directly linking to the people. But the way they rationalize it, the way Publius is rationalizing it, is he's saying, well, the voters voted for the state legislatures. So the state legislatures, they went and appointed the Senate. There's still a connection. There's still a linkage. What about the president? We know that the president is elected by the Electoral College, not directly by the people. But again, Publius is rationalizing this as, well, how do the electors get their job? In many states, they were being appointed by the state legislatures. In some states, the electors were getting directly voted in by the voters. Yes, it's the Electoral College that eventually elects the president, but remember, the voters had some say-so in electing the electors to get to the elected, the Electoral College, either directly or by electing state legislatures who appointed those electors. And then even with the judicial branch, the judiciary, we see that there is some, indirect linkage, or at least that's the way Publius is rationalizing it, that, yeah, the president nominates them and the Senate confirms them, but how did the president and Senate get elected? Well, indirectly by the people, right, through these other routes. So the justification here is that somehow all the different branches of the government and the people that are in charge in those branches of government are at least indirectly connected to a mandate from the people. What about this next question of federal, or actually we can say national and state power? So, Publius says that a lot of people are complaining about this Constitution, that it violates the principles of a federal form of a union. This was supposed to be a federal form of the union. And the critique really here is that what they're saying, they're calling it a federal form of the union, but what they really are saying, what they're kind of indicating is that this is what they mean by federal is that this should be a government where the states retain most of the power. We would now use the term confederal for what they're referring to here, but they're using the term federal loosely here to say a government where the state governments retain the power. They say that, the state government should retain the power, and they're a little concerned. There are some people that are critiquing this Constitution and saying it gives too much power at the national level. But then, of course, the founder or the author here goes on to say that there are significant ways that this Constitution needs to be national in its scope. So after they've posed this notion of there's state power and then there's national power, the rest of this document is just the author discussing how the Constitution is actually both of those things. In some ways, it preserves power at the state level. In other ways, it preserves power at the national level. So first of all, let's talk about some ways that the Constitution looks very state-oriented. It says in its foundations, it's sort of state-oriented because the states elected delegates at conventions, right? They came to conventions and they ratified the Constitution. In order for the Constitution to be ratified, state conventions had to be held, and each individual state had to hold these conventions to ratify, or to decide whether to ratify the Constitution. Those delegates were elected per each state, right? So the states were sort of in charge of that ratification. If a certain number of states did not sign on to the Constitution, it would not be enacted. The other place that we can see why states were important is the source of power in the Senate, right? We already talked about this. State governments were appointing the senators originally, usually through the state legislature. And the other place, we can see that this sort of the concept of states having power is that all of the different states had equal representation. It's this idea that they're all sort of peers, right? And that they all should have equal power in the Senate. We can also see, sort of state focus in the fact that the Constitution allowed states to retain authority. It actually reserved authority for the states in areas that were not specifically enumerated for the national government. So there's this list of powers of Congress in the first article of the Constitution, and that list of the powers of Congress are enumerated powers that the national government gets. But then, we know from the 10th Amendment in the Constitution that anything that wasn't enumerated for the national government was sort of thought of as reserved for the states. Now, we've had sort of a tipping of the balance of power over time in this. The national government has been able to take a little bit more power, one might argue, than its specifically enumerated powers over time. But back in this original Constitution, when it was first coming out, it was a pretty strict notion that, there's the enumerated powers for the national government, and that's what the national government got to do, but everything else was pretty much reserved for the states. So the states are reserving power and authority in certain areas, or had them reserved for the states. And then finally, a majority of the states, 3/4 of the states, were required to ratify an amendment. So if there's a change made to the Constitution, that's got to go through the states. The Congress can't just start putting amendments in. It has to be ratified by a very large number, 3/4, 75% of the states, to get that amendment ratified. So these are all ways that we see state power that is important and is prioritized in the Constitution. But what about national level power? Well, they say that, first of all, national laws directly operate on the citizens as individuals. There are national level laws. They are directly operating on the citizens. They don't have to be mediated through the state. If the national government is acting within its enumerated powers, then it is going directly to operate those laws on the citizens as individuals. Also, in the House, we know that the source of power was that they are elected by the citizens. They are not elected by the state legislatures. The citizens are directly electing those folks to, or those representatives to the House of Representatives. So, the states are sort of not really the functional selecting body there. So that shows sort of more of a national focus. And then finally, the amendment process is binding in and on all states. So if an amendment is passed, while it might be true that 3/4 of the states have to ratify it, what if 25% of the states didn't ratify it? They voted no. Well, that amendment is still binding on that state. And so that shows how the national government, right? The national government as a consolidated whole is operating. Those amendments are functional in every state, not just in the states that voted for them and opted into them, but in all states. So ultimately, what Publius concludes is that the Constitution has created a blended system. And this blended system is one where, in many ways, the Constitution is shoring up and reserving power at the state level. This is what Federalist 39 was using. They were using the term federal, but what they're really getting at is it was more of a confederal system where there is power reserved for the states. But also the Constitution provides many aspects of national power where it is the nationwide centralized sort of government that is exercising the power. You get both of those. This blended system that includes elements of both national level authority and state level authority is now what we call federalism. So when you hear the term federalism now, what we mean is that approach to government where both the national and the state level governments exercise power and authority in their specific areas. Okay, I hope this was helpful for you. And remember to do your quiz on the Federalist Papers, which you'll have at least one question from this Federalist Paper 39 on that quiz. Hope this was helpful for you. Thanks a lot.